Hello, and welcome to today's episode of On the Rocks. Today I'm excited to introduce you to Zainab Usman, a senior fellow and director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her expertise is in institutions, economic policy, energy policy, and emerging economies in Africa. She previously worked at the World Bank on issues of social sustainability, policy reforms, natural resource management, and disruptive technologies in Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, Nigeria, Papua New Guinea, the Republic of Congo, Serbia, Tanzania, and Uzbekistan. Zainab is the author of the new book, Economic Diversification in Nigeria, The Politics of Building a Post-Oil Economy, which was selected as one of the best books of 2022 in economics by the Financial Times. She is also co-editor of the book, The Future of Work in Africa, Harnessing the Potential of Digital Technologies for All, and she contributed to the World Bank's flagship report on rethinking power sector reforms in developing countries. On today's episode, we talk about the differences and similarities between oil-based economies and mining-based economies and what right looks like when a country manages their natural resources. Pour a drink and let's dive in. Well, Zainab, thank you so much for joining me today on the Rocks. I'm really excited to talk to you and learn from you today. I've been following your work for a while, so excited to share what you're doing with our listeners. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be here, Emily.
So to kick it off, because I think it would be really good to hear what have you been working on lately, and can you give us just a short overview of what you've been researching and writing about and talking about?
So I'm currently the director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This is a think tank in Washington, D.C., in fact, one of the major think tanks in the U.S. The program that I lead works on economic development in Africa and how it relates to foreign policy. A key element of the work that we do is with respect to climate change and in particular the energy transition. We are looking at how African countries will navigate this shift to a low carbon future that we're kind of all experiencing around the world. In particular, we are looking at how countries in Africa rich in natural resources, whether oil and gas or minerals, are going to navigate this transition. My own background is I've worked on energy policy, economic policy, in academia, as well as at the World Bank. And in fact, Emily, I don't know if you remember, but that's where we met at the World Bank when I was working with the Extractives Group for workshop on digital technologies and the mining sector.
The innovation panel, right?
Yes. Exactly. That was where we met.
That feels forever ago. That was pre.
I know. That was pre-COVID. It was just about 4 or 5 years ago, but it feels like a decade ago because so much has happened since then. Yes. So in a sense, that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm doing a lot more, but I think relevant to this podcast today, that is really a key element of the work that I'm doing. And it's kind of part of my own background too, working in resource-rich countries and figuring out how they can diversify their economies, what successes they've recorded on that respect, and what failures they've experienced.
And I'd love to hear from you what you think about similarities and differences in countries or economies that are petroleum or oil and gas based as compared to mining, because I think sometimes people group them together and think that those economies would look very similar. And in reality, at least in my experience, they're very different because the industries are, in fact, very different.
Absolutely. Very, very different economies because the resources themselves are very different. So maybe I can start with the similarities and a few things to mention on that front that perhaps make people think oil and gas and mining are all the same when in reality they really are not. First similarity, I would say, is that these are all non-renewable natural resources that once you deplete them, you cannot replenish them within the span of our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our great-great-great-grandchildren. They take, tens of thousands of years to form, and geologists would explain that to us very, very well. But importantly, these are also, and the reason they're so important is they are input to various types of economic activities and indeed a lot of industrial activities. So from, the process of manufacturing, whether it's for petrochemicals, whether it's for energy generation, power generation in particular, you think about oil or coal and all of that. So they are economic and industrial inputs. And the process of their extraction tends to be very capital intensive, requiring vast amounts of investments, oftentimes with significant environmental and social impacts, right? You think about onshore oil production, or mining extraction, mineral extraction. So there are some similarities there. Then another similarity I can think of is the revenues that are generated from this activity from the host countries, regardless of the kind of fiscal regime they have or the kind of institutions they have, or constitutional provisions around the management of the sector. In many countries around the world, particularly low and middle income countries, these are sectors that are considered to be very strategic. So there's significant government involvement, whereas in certain parts of the world, certainly here in the US, but also in perhaps I think in the US that I know of very well, this tends to be a private sector dominated activity for the most part. So
Right.
the resource itself can be owned by the individual on whose land you make the discovery. Whereas in many parts of the world, whether in Asia or in Africa or in the Middle East, even if an individual owns the land, once you make that discovery, it becomes a state asset in a sense.
Right.
Then the relationship becomes very complicated. So then back to the discussion on revenues, where this matters is that in many parts of the world, because this is therefore a state asset, whether it's gold reserves or oil and gas reserves, that then has implications for revenue. So oftentimes you have a state-owned company involved in the process of extraction. It might go into joint venture partnerships or some kind of arrangement with a foreign company, or sometimes you have a multinational corporation going into that process of extraction. That then means that ultimately the government of that country is able to capture significant revenues from the export or the sale of this commodity. And this applies particularly to low and middle income countries where the main way of capturing revenues from these commodities is by exports. They
Right.
often don't have the domestic capacity to process these commodities. So exports are very, very crucial. Export of minerals, whether it's oil, whether it's gold or copper or nickel, or oil in particular, and I mean increasingly gas. The dynamics of gas are also very, very different from oil, by the way. So revenues, they tend to be quite large, typically captured by the government, which then leads to a third element here of the commonality between the two types of commodities. Because of this, the fact that the revenues are generated via exports, there's a strong external dimension, meaning that the economies are susceptible to volatility, or they are vulnerable to the volatility of international prices of these commodities because they're traded internationally.
And the cyclical nature of commodity cycles in particular, right?
Exactly. Yes. So there's some kind of volatility there. There are price swings, right? Especially for countries that are not price makers. They don't produce significant volumes or quantities of these commodities to singularly be able to determine the global prices. So a price maker in this sense would be a country like Saudi Arabia, which is the world's second largest oil producer, the United States, which is now the world's top oil producer, if I'm not mistaken. With respect to copper, you can think about maybe Chile, maybe Zambia. With respect to nickel, you can think about Indonesia. So these countries across the board, they produce significant volumes or quantities of these commodities that if anything were to disrupt that production, the global price would be affected. So, but for a lot of other countries, they are not price makers, they're price takers. They don't determine the international price. So they're even more vulnerable to the volatility of these prices. And then maybe one final point of similarity between the two, and I think it's something we will come to a bit later, is that I know today in 2023, the 2020s, the oftentimes the common perceptions or mainstream perceptions of oil and gas and minerals is often a bit negative.
Yeah.
But the reality is these commodities are the basis for industrialization. Most of the countries around the world that were able to industrialize were often, there are some that are mineral-rich countries, including the United States and Canada and Australia, oil-rich countries. So these commodities can be the basis, can be the springboard for industrialization, for a country to be able to transition from low income to middle income to high income, for a country to be able to have more technological diffusion across its entire economy, which would then lift people out of poverty, help create jobs, help increase standards of living. So those are some similarities, and maybe we can go into some of the differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to echo your last point, I think that's what a lot of times people forget in in countries that have already developed off of their extractive industry, that's part of what allowed certain countries to industrialize, right? And there's a lot of kind of finger pointing sometimes at countries that are trying to still develop those resources and use it further industrialized by countries that are already there when we did the same thing, right? That's how we got where we are. So I think that's a really, really important point. So on that, how are the two different though? Like if a country or an economy is primarily oil or gas based compared to mining industry different, how are they different? What do you see there?
Great. Talking about differences, let me mention 2 or 3. The first that comes to mind is really even the process of extracting these commodities is very, very different. With crude oil, which is then kind of petroleum, or petroleum as one of the derivatives, depending on whether the petroleum resources are onshore or offshore, you could have the production or extraction taking place on the landmass of that country, or it could be happening in the sea, offshore. That's offshore production. With offshore production, it tends to be even more enclave, more kind of isolated than usual. So the oil industry, and it has this reputation for being very enclave is the word that is used, very isolated, even when it's happening onshore or like within on a country's landmass. Mm-hmm. It happens within a specific area, specific jurisdiction, specific region. So that there's that enclave nature, physically, but also that process of extraction and production, if care is not taken, is very dissociated from the rest of the economy. It is not a sector or an industry that creates a lot of jobs, despite the volumes of capital invested, billions of dollars needed to actually do the exploration and start the process of production. For that amount of capital invested and sunk in, the jobs that are created tend to be very, very minimal.
Sure.
It's very common to find that the petroleum industry in a country, if concerted efforts are not made to add value and to have to do like domestic processing, whether it's with petrochemicals or refining, you find that if it's just that process of extraction, you have no more than a few thousand jobs, right? Despite this being an industry worth billions of dollars. With the mining sector, it also has that enclave feature in the sense that mining is a very physical activity. It takes place in a specific area where those mineral reserves are found and located, but it just tends to be a bit more labor intensive. It's capital intensive as well. It requires lots of billions of dollars of investments and technology, but there tends to be more people engaged in the mining sector, particularly in low and middle income countries, where for a whole variety of reasons, there probably isn't as much deployment of like automation and robotics as you find in places like Australia or parts of Canada, for example. So it tends to be a bit more labor intensive, but then the impact also on the host communities tends to be a bit more visible, a lot more physical. And for that reason, historically, mining has been very, very contentious in certain parts of the world because the physical impacts are very visible and very, very evident. So that's one difference I would like to highlight. A second one is with respect to the scale of revenues generated from these two industries. With petroleum and with crude oil and more broadly, you find that the scale of revenues are much larger than the mining industry and the mining sector for a whole range of reasons. I think first of all, the dynamics of the global market with respect to oil are very different from the mining industry. And in fact, with respect to the mining industry, you have different commodities, right? There are precious metals, there are, industrial minerals, they have different qualities, they have different value. So it's not necessarily uniform. Whereas with crude oil, it's the revenues that a country generates from oil production tend to be much, much higher on a much bigger scale than you have with respect to the mining sector. And I want to give a concrete example here. Two countries that come to mind, which were mineral producers. And as mineral producers, they were able to generate significant revenues. Ghana and Guyana. So Ghana, gold producer for hundreds of years, actually. And Guyana too, which is a gold producer and I think also has bauxite, has been mining bauxite and gold for a couple of decades. But recently, both countries became oil producers. Ghana within the last decade, and Guyana within the last 3 or 4 years. And you can already see, the scale of revenues they are getting from their oil industries is absolutely incomparable to what they've been earning from their mining industry. So I'm going to stop there with respect to the differences.
And from what I've seen in the countries I've worked in, where primarily they've been petroleum-based, trying to diversify by adding in some mining investment. I think there's also differences in the industries, like the time it takes to come into production that is dramatically different, right? I mean, oil, you could have a well producing in 6 months, right? Whereas, an average small to medium-sized gold mine is like 5 to 7 years, right? So there's also this longer, very visible, as you mentioned, footprint, but also a longer time until people see the true benefit of actual production. that I think also leads to differences in community relationships and engagement, as well as federal government policies like monetary policies, tax and royalty based policies, because there's just a lot that can happen as a mine is being built. And there's, it's such a long time that sometimes people don't understand how long it's going to take. And that sets like false expectations, I think, at all levels in markets.
Absolutely. I think the question or the issue of expectations cuts across the board, but is certainly more prevalent in the mining sector, the mining industry, in the sense that for the most part, for many policymakers, especially those who are not industry specialists, or they're not like the minister of mining, etc., and also the media, this expectation that once there's a resource discovery, then there's going to be an immediate windfall.
Right.
The windfall is going to be, like within the next few years, which is not really the case. You need to have all of the investments in place. It really just takes time to set up the entire system of production, extraction, export, the fiscal regime. You need to negotiate that. So those expectations, managing them and ensuring that they align as close as possible to reality is absolutely essential.
I also think in lower and middle income countries in particular, if they've been exposed to the oil industry, it's the big companies that come in right away, right? It's the BP, Exxon, Eni, like it's the big global brands that come in and do the exploration. So they're dealing with a big company presence from the very beginning. Whereas in mining, it really starts with the crazy geologists that go out and find a rock that looks interesting, or a junior explorer, much, much smaller companies that have much smaller budgets in order to do exploration, and then try to sell that asset or raise investment to kind of move it up into a larger company status. And I think sometimes even just from like a cultural perspective, governments are used to working with a big multinational company, and then all of a sudden they're dealing with a random geologist who's wandering around the countryside. It's two very different groups of people to work with, and how to negotiate licenses and terms. And sometimes I feel those government officials are like, what is up with this industry? Like, who are these people? They're expecting it to be Barrick or BHP walking in the door from the very beginning, and it's not how the industry works.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. With all the crazy geologists on both sides. Well, in what you study and in what you write and talk about, there's a lot that's said in general about what it looks like when countries become dependent on the natural resource or the extractives industry in the wrong way, or too dependent, or issues of corruption or mismanagement. But are there some examples of what right looks like? Like, what are some examples of where countries have really developed their natural resources in a responsible way to really help industrialize, and where the people have really seen of that?
Yeah, very good question. In fact, I would say that there's sometimes an overemphasis on all of the ways in which countries that are rich in natural resources have gotten it wrong. And in the process of identifying that problem, I think that the way the problem itself is diagnosed has been quite problematic. Mm-hmm. Why do I say that? And I'll address that, and then I'll come to your question specifically. Because if you're trying to address a problem, if you don't have a close to accurate diagnosis, you'll be treating the wrong disease in a sense, right? What I mean specifically here is that in some of the countries that on the surface level seem to have just not been able to manage those natural resources, the problem has often been attributed to the commodity itself, right? There's this phenomenon called resource curse, which in my book, I'm actually questioning and challenging because we also know of a lot of countries that have used these natural resources as a springboard for their development, whether it's the US or Canada or Australia or Chile or a number of others. There are countries that are middle income today or get into upper middle income, whether it's Botswana or Malaysia. I mentioned Chile already, a couple of others that have not done badly.
Right.
Then there are countries that have just not done well. But if you compare them with their peers that are not rich in natural resources, they also haven't done well either. So it's probably not the resource itself. There's a broader challenge that we need to be able to grapple with. So the diagnostic or the diagnosis is absolutely essential that we get that right. Which then leads me to the countries that have been able to do well with respect to their natural resources. Of course, we know the high-income countries, North America here. Think about the United States with the gold rush in California, Canada too, and then being both major oil producers within the top 10 globally. Australia as well within the top 10 oil producers, Norway. But beyond those, because sometimes you mention these high-income wealthy countries and it would seem as if they were able to make their transitions, they were able to figure things out decades ago. So why don't we focus on middle-income countries, countries that have been able to figure things out a bit more recently? And here I think of Chile. I think about Botswana in Africa, diamond producer, which is upper middle income. It is middle income, not upper middle income, but it also has not experienced conflict or civil wars. It's fairly stable. Sure, it has a problem of inequality, but many countries around the world are fairly unequal. Serious levels of inequality.
Yeah.
I think one essential thing is really having a broad strategy from the perspective of the governments as to what they want to do with the natural resource sector. So it's such an important and strategic sector that you cannot just be kind of very laissez-faire about it. There needs to be some kind of strategy. We've seen that with Botswana, that early on in the I think it was the 1970s or so, the ruling elite under the Botswana Development Party made it very clear that they wanted to use the diamonds as a springboard for national development. They wanted to ensure that their diamond wealth did not become, a driver of conflict and instability.
Right.
They put in place macroeconomic policies, and there was some kind of consistency in the way policies were implemented. They set up a sovereign wealth fund at some point, the Pula Fund. We can also look at Chile on that front with their state-owned company, the Codelco. Across the board, I think you would find like policy variations, policy differences, but one thing that kind of runs through these countries that have kind of succeeded is some kind of consistency, some kind of, first of all, a consensus among the leaders, business leaders, political leaders, as to where they want to take their resource sector. And then being consistent in the policies that they choose. And there's a variety of policy. What may work for one country may not necessarily be neatly replicated in another country. But whatever they choose, they are a bit consistent with it. And that helps with investor confidence, giving investors some kind of certainty and predictability about the business environment. They're able to negotiate a meaningful revenue a fiscal regime to begin with investors. And there's, again, that consistency, stability, and predictability. That would be the basic foundational thing that I would say you see across the board in countries that have done fairly well.
Yeah, and I think from an investor perspective, investors are even comfortable with regulatory structures or strategies that aren't perfect or they don't agree with 100% if they're stable and they're able to adapt their plans according to that, right? I think that's certainly what I hear is that they'd rather have something be stable and imperfect rather than constantly trying to get to the perfect and having things change, kind of change the rules regularly. No, I was just going to say, I think that's such a great point that you made that it's not the commodity, it's not the industry, because there are examples of mismanagement in countries without resources or similar issues across the board. And I think, again, it's oftentimes a critique that I find people make in countries that are more developed or higher income, right? When those economies, in most cases, have been built over decades or 100+ years on those industries. So no, I think that's a really good point. Well, in going back to that about investors and what they look at, we always like to share with folks or ask our guests to share, like, what should an investor look at if they're considering a project in some of these jurisdictions? How should they incorporate some of your findings and conclusions into how they evaluate a potential investment in those areas? Not that you're an advisor or making recommendations, but just in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
people keep in mind and what should they look?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So at a very broad level, perhaps before I get into that, just a caveat that I know every country is different.
Right. Yeah.
The specific conditions that would enable and allow for investments to flow into a specific country would vary significantly. So I wanted to just put that caveat out there. Having said that, maybe I'll highlight a few things. The first is going back to the point I made earlier about having a country having some kind of political consensus as to where it sees itself in the next 5, 10, 15, 5 years is probably even too short, in the next 20, 30, 40 years, just some kind of clear vision in the country, and a vision that is broadly shared by key stakeholders, including the political elite, the policymakers, but also the domestic business in the country, should give investors a sense of whether it makes sense to go into a particular country at a certain point in time. Now, as you've seen, I've emphasized on a vision first, rather than the kinds of reports you read about political stability in a country or conflict or corruption or all these things. They matter, but we've seen from the evidence of the historical experience of different parts of the world that, whether it's a country like Indonesia, whether it's Malaysia, when they started out on the path they are today, they were not 100% stable. They had political tensions. There was corruption. Many parts of Asia had a lot of corruption. But if there is some kind of consensus within that country among key decision makers that they are serious about moving their country forward, that they are serious about having laws, policies, and regulations around the mining sector or the oil and gas sector that give some measure of predictability, I think that is something that investors should take seriously, and they shouldn't just rely on media reports, which are often over sensationalized, as we all know. They give a distorted picture of what is going on the ground in a country. I think a second point that I might mention here is increasingly now in the 2020s, with all of the advocacies we're seeing around indigenous rights, local communities, participation, inclusion, it would be good also for investors to actively think of how they can partner with the domestic private sector in a country. Because when you do that, then you're able to mitigate or preempt a lot of future problems. When you find ways of partnering with the domestic private sector, they know the landscape better. They have relationships within the community, potential problems that you might have with communities, those could be prevented because they know people. If you get good stakeholders who are quite invested in those countries and those communities, then you can prevent a lot of future problems from coming up.
Yeah.
I would say.
Probably.
Yeah. So
to anticipate if you're not from there, right? I mean, just things that you would think of. Yeah.
Exactly. So those are probably two things I would highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. I could say that in my experience, that's been the biggest factor of a successful project in a new jurisdiction has been our relationship with a local partner. And doing that from the very beginning as well, because if you have that local partnership, even at the assessment and the planning stage, then your plans are more accurate and they're built to be successful from the very beginning, as opposed to flying in from the US and assuming that you know what needs to be done, putting a ton of money into feasibility studies and assumptions, and then 6 months down the road, you have to redo everything when you realize it's not right for the environment. Yeah. Well, I guess as our last question, as our listeners know, is always a fun one. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the mining industry, just overnight, no work needed, like you don't have to convince anybody, you don't have to do anything, it just changes overnight, what would you change?
Let me think about that for a bit. What would I change? I would say the relationships with communities where the mining takes place. If that could improve significantly, that could really help transform perceptions about the mining industry. I'm a researcher, I'm a social scientist, I'm not a geologist or a mining engineer. But I get very worried when I hear how, the discourse on the mining industry is very, very skewed. It's very negative. I find it unhelpful because there are a lot of misperceptions there.
Sure.
But the misperceptions are also resulting from the kind of difficult relationships that have existed with communities, especially in low and middle income countries. So those have created, what we're all trying to battle and fight today.
Yeah.
Because this is an industry that is so essential. A lot of the everyday things we have here that I have in my office, that you have in your office, they're resulting from this process of mining, mineral production, and extraction. So it is essential to our everyday lives, but because relationships with communities have not been very well managed in the past, we now have such a skewed perception of the industry. So that's probably one thing I would change if I could wave a wand.
Yeah. And I think you're also, to your point, the perceptions will change when the industry starts to do things differently and better, right? You can't just change perceptions without changing how we are active in communities and how we talk about our work, right? The work has to start with us. You're not going to change people's minds by doing things the same way over and over again.
Indeed.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on. And as I mentioned in the intro, please, I really encourage everyone to check out your book and some of your publications. And I'm really excited to continue following your work. Thanks so much for coming on The Rocks.
Thank you very much, Emily. Looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Absolutely.